Chapter 1. Education as a necessity of life. Renewal of life by transmission. The most notable distinction between living and inanimate things is that the former maintain themselves by renewal. A stone, when struck, resists. If the resistance is greater than the force of the blow struck, it remains outwardly unchanged. Otherwise, it is shattered into smaller pieces. Never does the stone attempt to react in such a way that it may maintain itself against the blow, much less so as to render the blow a contributing factor of its own continued action. While the living thing may easily be crushed by superior force, it nonetheless tries to turn the energies which act upon it into a means of its own further existence. If it cannot do so, it does not just split into smaller pieces, at least in the higher forms of life. It loses its identity as a living thing.